Hi, Living Earth. This next category of content is going to be population ecology. Once again, you should be on the notes document that is associated with this lecture, and you should be following along and filling in the blanks as I go. So, first of all, I want to just go ahead and define a habitat for you. A habitat is a natural environment in which an organism lives. And a habitat specifically includes all the physical and biotic factors in that area. So anything that's alive in that area and anything that is not alive. And if you recall from the last lecture, I'm talking about biotic versus abiotic, living versus non-living things. A population itself, let's just define that for a second. A population is a group of organisms that, one, belong to the same species, two, live in the same place at the same time, and three, can interbreed with one another. So if I'm talking about a population of organisms, these things apply. So an example of a population would be all the gazelle living in South Kenya during whatever period of time you're looking at it. Here is just kind of an example, a picture example of all the different stages of groups of organisms that we could be talking about. So we could be talking about a singular organism, which you see all the way over here on the left, this little single gazelle right here, or you could be talking about a population of those organisms, so a population of gazelle, as I said before. Or in the next stage up, you could be talking about a community of organisms, which is several populations living together. Or you could be talking about an entire ecosystem, all the living and non-living things that happen to be in that ecosystem or affect it. Or at the very other end of the spectrum, you could be talking about the entire biosphere, which is pretty much just the Earth. Everything on the Earth that happens to be alive. Okay, so that's just to give you an idea of the stages and the different terms for different types of things that we'll be talking about. So next, what are some properties of populations? Well, the first thing that is always talked about is population size, which is pretty self-explanatory. It's the numbers of individuals that whatever population it is contains. So I just included a little bit of a graphic. Here we have the entire world population. Obviously, everybody that's alive in the world is everybody that's alive in the world, so we have 100%. China accounts for about 19, almost 20% of the population of the world as of 2014. So yes, this data is fairly old, but it's just to kind of put in perspective different populations of people in the world and what percentages they represent of the total population. Okay, another thing we talk about is population density. And density we actually touched on in the last lecture about carrying capacity, but what it is a measure of how crowded a population is. And it's measured in terms of the number of individuals per unit area. So here, there might only be, I don't know, 10 total tigers in this big, big territory, but with higher density populations, there's going to be, 20, 30 in a square foot, or 10 or 15 in a square foot, as you might see with these sea anemones. Density is going to be affected by the availability of resources. So thinking about carrying capacity from last week, if a population is more dense, that means that that ecosystem has the resources to support that population usually. The density is going to be higher where those resources are plentiful. So if water is one of those limiting factors, which it pretty much always is, you're going to see a higher population of organisms around water sources than you will in the middle of a desert, because a desert doesn't have enough water to support lots of organisms. And obviously, on the other side of that, populations are going to be lower density where resources are scarce, such as in a desert. Population distribution is another thing we talk about. And that's how organisms are distributed in their environments relative to one another. So organisms could be clumped together. They could be evenly distributed in their environment, or they could be randomly distributed in their environment. And down here are examples of those and what they look like. A clumped pattern is going to be very, very common in nature because it's rare that organisms will evenly distribute themselves, because that's not how nature works. Nature's a little bit more chaotic than that. Not only that, but they will clump themselves around resources. Like the example that I stated earlier of organisms clumping themselves around water, or even fish schooling together, swans flocking together. All of these organisms are going to stay together in a clumped pattern because it's either safer or they're around a resource that they need. Okay, another pattern that you could see is a uniform distribution. And this distribution usually means that the distance between two organisms is usually maximized. It's usually really big. And where you tend to see that is in big territories. For example, tigers have very big territories. You're going to find one, maybe two tigers in the same territory, and they're going to be spread out fairly evenly in the space that's available to them. Another distribution you could see is randomly distributed. So that's when you can't really predict how the spacing is between individuals. And this is pretty uncommon because usually the predicting factor is a resource. If it looks random, there's probably a lot of water or a lot of nutrients in the soil or whatever that's clumping those organisms in a pattern that seems random. But if there's unpredictable factors in the environment, like unpredictable wind patterns or current patterns, that can cause a random distribution of organisms, especially in the water. Thinking about how some sort of egg could be spread randomly in the water, or if you're talking about plants, seeds can be distributed randomly throughout the year, and wherever they land is where they're going to sprout and grow, assuming that there is a resource there to support them. What determines distribution in a habitat? So whatever the tolerance range of that species is. So each species has a certain tolerance range for their different factors, and what I mean by that is an amount of water that they need, an amount of space that they need, an amount of food that they particularly need. And organisms are going to be abundant where their survival conditions are met or optimal. So if I'm a fish, I'm not going to go hang out in a desert, one, because I couldn't even get there, and two, because there's no water. There's not the type of food that I would require there. So you're going to find fish in the water where their factors for their survival, their tolerance range is met or even optimal for their survival. So that's pretty logical. It sounds fancy, but really just where an organism survives is where you're going to find it. Here we see this nice little bell curve graph. And it looks very, very, very complicated, but I'll explain it to you right now. This top pink line, so from here to here on the graph, is where an organism can survive in whatever environment, but in this example, they're using butterflies. So the middle of the bell curve, where you see that the population is the highest, or the number of organisms, if you see this little y-axis up here, they're going to be the most plentiful in their preferred niche, in their optimum range, where the resources that they need to survive are the most plentiful, being they have enough space, enough water, enough food, whatever it happens to be. On the outer end, though, where you see this thing that says zone of physiological stress, this is an area where they don't have the best set of resources, but it's possible for them to survive. But obviously that population is going to be lower, because if they're running low on food or water or shelter or all three, it's harder for an organism to survive like that. And then out on this outer end, we see the zone of intolerance on either side, which means that it is not survivable in this particular environment for those organisms. So down on the bottom, you can see this pH scale and this temperature scale. So for this graph, you could say, okay, well, maybe the pH of their environment is wrong. It's too basic, too alkaline, or too acidic. Or you could say the temperature is wrong for their survival. It's too hot or it's too cold. Being too cold and too hot or too basic or too acidic would make those organisms die and become an unavailable niche for them. So that's why you get this bell curve distribution that you're seeing here. Whatever factor is making it intolerable for organisms out here, whereas here in any particular environment, they can survive. What influences the size and distribution of populations? Well, first, you're going to see species interacting with one another. There's never a point in time where species never run into any other thing, ever. You're going to see predation happening. You're going to see competition happening. You're going to see parasitism happening. And those three things are going to limit population numbers. But on the flip side of that, you could also have a mutualistic relationship between organisms that could enable two species to exist in greater numbers than they would by themselves. So two species can benefit one another rather than just limiting each other. It just depends on what those two species relationships are. Competition for resources, I talked about briefly in the other lecture. It's when two or more organisms are competing for the same limited resource: food, water, space, shelter, whatever that resource happens to be. You could have a couple of different types of competition though. You could have intra-specific competition, which is competition occurring between members of the same species. So in this example, you see two cheetahs fighting over some sort of food. And that's going to limit population size because those species are competing for the same resource, and if whoever doesn't get it is less likely to survive. Territoriality and social hierarchies, that can reduce the conflict between members of the same species, but it's also very important for determining which individuals are going to breed with one another, so that every single organism isn't breeding with every single other organism. And it kind of streamlines that process and it limits that population because only certain members of that species are allowed to mate in that situation. The other type of competition that you see is inter-specific competition. Notice that that's different than intra. Inter-specific is between members of different species. And that can limit population as well, like this tiger and this bear fighting right here. If one of them dies, then obviously that population would be limited. We have competitive exclusion principle. And what that is two species cannot coexist in a community if their niches are identical. So what I mean by a niche is the way an organism fits into its ecological community or its role within that community. So, for example, this little picture on the side, picture 1 has yellow birds existing, and then picture 2 has red birds coming into the picture. And you'll notice that in picture 2, the red birds are not sitting on the tree because the yellow birds are sitting there. They're taking up that role in the ecosystem. So for the red birds to have somewhere to sit, the yellow birds have to go somewhere else. Because of that competition, they're not going to coexist in the same way because they're filling the same space in that ecosystem. Last thing I want to talk about is biodiversity. So biodiversity is the variety of life found in any particular area. So how many different species there happen to be in a particular area. We measure it by species richness, and I'm sorry that this kind of got cut off here, but it refers to the number of unique species in a particular area. Okay, so how many different species there are. This next thing is species evenness, which is the relative number of individuals of each species in an area. So it's a little different than species richness, because here in this M&M picture, let's say there's black M&Ms, orange, blue, red, green, and yellow, but these species, were they a species, would be evenly distributed because there's 3 of each. But let's pretend I had 1 black M&M and 7 red M&Ms and 2 greens and whatever else. Then that species distribution would be uneven, even though there's the same number of species in an environment. So here's another graphic to just kind of explain it. Between the top picture here and the bottom picture down there, there's the same number of species present in either one. You can see these lighter green trees, the dark green trees, the pines, the lighter pines. They exist in both pictures. But in the top picture, the evenness is very similar because there's 4 or 5 of each kind of tree, versus in the bottom picture, there's the same number of species present, but this dark green kind of fluffy looking tree has dominated this area. So between the 2 pictures, if you had a drought or something, it would affect these 2 communities differently. Another thing is genetic diversity, and that is the amount of variation that you see within members of a population. So this picture, this is all corn, but there's a lot of genetic diversity there. All the corn looks different. So if there's a high amount of genetic diversity, you'll see a lot of different traits within the same species. And if there's a low amount of genetic diversity, it means all the members of that species are going to look pretty much the same. And last but not least, why does biodiversity matter? Well, ecosystems, they're dynamic and they respond to changes. And if there's a lot of different species, a lot of different diversity in organisms, those ecosystems become more stable. And we'll talk about why that is, but just know for this point that if there are more species, that ecosystem is more stable.